I still remember the day we moved into that house. It was supposed to be a fresh start for me, my wife Clara, and our son, Daniel. We had left behind the chaos of the city, looking for peace in the quiet countryside. Little did we know, the house we had chosen was anything but peaceful. It wasn't just an ordinary old house. It had eyes, unblinking, watchful eyes that seemed to follow your every move. We didn't notice it at first, but soon it became clear that we were not the only ones living in that house. The house stood alone at the end of a long, winding road, surrounded by thick trees on all sides. It was old, perhaps a century or more, and had been abandoned for years before we found it. The walls were cracked, and the windows were clouded with dust. But Clara loved it instantly. "It has character," she said, smiling as she ran her fingers over the chipped wooden railings. Daniel, our curious 7-year-old, ran up the stairs, his laughter echoing through the empty hallways. I remember feeling a chill as I stood in the doorway, staring at the house. Something about it felt off. The way the windows stared back at me, like they were watching, waiting. But I shook it off. It was just an old house, nothing more. It wasn't long after we moved in that things started happening. At first, it was little things, small objects going missing, strange noises at night, cold drafts blowing through rooms with no windows open. One evening, Clara was in the kitchen cooking dinner, and I was reading a book in the living room. Daniel was playing with his toys on the floor when he suddenly stopped and looked up, his eyes wide with fear. "Daddy," he whispered, pointing to the wall, "there's someone watching us." I looked where he was pointing, but there was nothing there. Just the old, faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. "There's no one there, buddy," I said, ruffling his hair. "You're just imagining things." But Daniel shook his head, his face pale. "No, Daddy. The house is looking at us." I didn't think much of it at the time. Kids have vivid imaginations, especially in a new place. But that night, as I lay in bed next to Clara, I couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel might be right. I could feel it. The house watching us, its eyes hidden in the walls, following every move we made. A few days later, I decided to explore the attic. We hadn't been up there since we moved in, and I thought it might be a good place to store some of our boxes. The stairs creaked as I made my way up, and the air grew colder the higher I climbed. The attic was dark, filled with old furniture and covered in thick layers of dust. In the corner, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. A large, antique mirror. It was tall and oval-shaped, with a heavy, ornate frame. The glass was cloudy and cracked in places, but as I approached it, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. In the reflection, I could see the room behind me, but there was something else. A shadow, a figure, standing just behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. The room was empty, silent, except for the sound of my own breathing. I looked back at the mirror. The figure was gone. I backed away from the mirror, my hands trembling. I didn't tell Clara about it. She loved the house so much, and I didn't want to scare her. But from that moment on, I knew something was wrong. The house wasn't just watching us, it was showing us things. Things that weren't supposed to be there. As the weeks passed, Clara began to change. She became distant, distracted. At first, I thought it was just the stress of moving, but it was more than that. One night, I woke up to find her standing at the window, staring out into the dark forest that surrounded the house. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. Clara, I whispered, sitting up. What are you doing? She didn't respond. She just stood there, staring. I got out of bed and walked over to her, placing my hand on her shoulder. She turned to look at me, and I froze. Her eyes, they weren't hers. They were cold, empty, like she wasn't even there. Clara, I repeated, my voice shaking. She blinked, and just like that, she was herself again. She smiled at me, though it didn't reach her eyes. I'm fine, she whispered, her voice hollow. Just couldn't sleep. But I knew something was wrong. The house was changing her. It was watching her, and it was taking her. It was Daniel who finally made me realize just how dangerous the house was. One morning, as we sat at the breakfast table, Daniel looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Daddy, he whispered, the house doesn't like us. What do you mean? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. The walls, they're watching. They don't want us here. A chill ran down my spine. I knew he was right. The house was alive, and it wanted something from us. But what? That night, I decided to confront the house. I went back up to the attic, determined to find answers. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. And then, just like before, the shadow appeared. But this time, it didn't just stand there. It moved. It reached out, its hand pressing against the glass, as if it was trying to break through. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. I could feel the house around me, closing in, watching, waiting. I couldn't stay there any longer. I had to get Clara and Daniel out of that house. I ran downstairs, calling for Clara, but she wasn't in the kitchen or the living room. Panic rose in my chest as I searched every room, but she was nowhere to be found. Finally, I found her in the basement. She was standing in the corner, her back to me, staring at the wall. Clara! I shouted, running to her. She turned slowly, and my blood ran cold. Her eyes, they were black, completely black, like the house had taken over her. You can't leave, she whispered, her voice not her own. The house won't let you. I grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the stairs. We're leaving, I said through gritted teeth. But as I dragged her up the stairs, the walls began to close in around us. The house was alive, and it wasn't going to let us go without a fight. We made it to the front door, but it wouldn't open. I could hear the walls creaking, the house groaning as if it was angry. The shadows around us began to move, creeping closer, wrapping around Clara like dark tendrils. I pulled harder on the door, desperate to get out. And just when I thought we were done for, the door flew open. We ran. We didn't stop until we were miles away from that house. But even now, as I sit here telling you this story, I can feel it watching me. I can see the shadows moving out of the corner of my eye. Because the house doesn't forget. It sees everything. And it's waiting. Waiting for us to return. And when it does, we won't be able to escape again.